Hello, welcome to SophieCo. I'm Shashi Tharoor. The United Nations is set to turn the ripe old age of 70, but continues to be pivotal in ensuring world peace and security. In a more competitive, multipolar world, can the UN adapt and remain the linchpin for global peace and diplomacy? Former United Nations Under-Secretary General Shashi Tharoor is with me today to discuss this.
As the UN General Assembly gets underway, reform is in the air, with developing new powers demanding a seat at the table. Can the UN sustain relevance in a fast-evolving world? Will it stick to its traditions and risk oblivion, or finally embark on the arduous road to long-awaited change?
Former United Nations Under-Secretary General, veteran diplomat and author Shashi Tharoor, welcome to the show. It's really great to have you with us. Now, Russia's President Vladimir Putin recently said decisions made outside of the United Nations are usually destined to fail. Iraq, Libya, the spread of ISIS are all examples of unilateral action failing. So why are some still pushing this one-sided approach?
Well, this is a tough one to answer because it is true that in some of these issues, it has been difficult to find consensus within the United Nations. And therefore, countries have felt that rather than do nothing, they need to intervene. The problem is that, of course, intervention by a self-appointed group of nations can never have the legitimacy that comes from a decision that comes with a decision made by a universal international organization like the UN. This is why countries like India, Norway, many countries will not send troops abroad for peacekeeping purposes unless there is a resolution of the UN Security Council authorizing it. And that kind of position means that when actions are undertaken outside this mandate, they will never have the same kind of acceptance and legitimacy elsewhere.
Now, the U.S.'s year-long campaign against Islamic State has yielded more questions than results. Is it time to find a solution through the United Nations? In what way can the United Nations consolidate forces against Islamic State?
Well, that too is a very difficult one to answer because the UN has not collectively been very good at peace enforcement. It has been good at peacekeeping. That is, that at the end of a conflict, the UN is unparalleled in its ability to come in, maintain the peace, and prevent a new conflict from arising. But to task the United Nations with peace enforcement is problematic because peace enforcement is essentially war-making, and war-making requires command and control structures and a military operational capacity that is difficult to cobble together with member states who are not military allies. This is why when the one occasion we can think of in recent years would have been when Operation Desert Storm was authorized by the UN Security Council, it was not all UN member states, but rather a coalition assembled by the United States and Saudi Arabia with UN blessing that pushed Mr. Saddam Hussein and his forces out of Kuwait. Now, that kind of action, that is authorizing military action against ISIS, remains a possibility. But the kind of collective action that your question was implying, to my mind, is not realistic because the countries involved are not part of a common military alliance.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. Is the UN lacking power to react to modern conflicts? Do they have the right tools to preserve the peace in war-torn countries? Preserve peace is the key two words here.
As a longtime UN person myself, I have tended to take the view that peacekeeping is what the UN should do and not war-making. Leave war-making to others, to national armies, to smaller coalitions, or to coalitions of the willing. Now, you ask, does this make the UN unsuitable for today's challenges? But it doesn't, because a lot of today's challenges don't necessarily require war fighting. There are other things that can be done. In the case of something like ISIS, clearly the military action against them on the ground in places like Iraq and Syria, where they have controlled territory, that is often best undertaken by local forces with just international support. But some of the other important things that go behind the scenes, information sharing, intelligence cooperation, raising public awareness, improving your public information capacity so that local populations are aware of the horrors perpetrated by the Islamic State and not seduced by them. All of those things can be done through the United Nations by all member states acting in concert.
The UN Security Council was severely undermined by the U.S. going into Iraq. And when the resolution to ensure a no-fly zone over Libya all of a sudden became a war to overthrow Gaddafi. Has the world changed to an extent that countries powerful enough can just ignore the UN security resolutions or, indeed the UN as a whole with impunity?
There are precedents for various cases where countries have acted on their own responsibility and their own initiative when they judged that their national interests so dictated. What happened in 2003 over Iraq, however, was that the countries that marched into Iraq did so after failing to get council approval for a resolution that they were trying to present. They actually sought the UN Security Council's approval initially. And after 6 or 7 weeks of fruitless negotiations, when they realized they didn't have a majority or even a number in the council to pass a resolution, they then went on their own. And that's what made that case a bit different and a bit troubling for votaries of international law, because they said that you can't have a situation where you try and get legal approval, and then when that's not given to you, you do something without that approval. But these are many of the cases that require further study. My own feeling is that one can't entirely prevent member states from doing what they judge best, and frankly also what they believe they can get away with. But they won't do things that would risk provoking a wider conflagration. So if there is serious opposition from other states, then I think, and other major states, then one state may hesitate to take this kind of action on its own. In the kinds of situations we're seeing, of course, there is no great urgency or desire on the part of many countries to confront the ISIS forces on the ground. They are perhaps willing to bomb from the air, but beyond that, I think all they're prepared to do is give support to local forces. There is no great willingness to take a risk of their own lives and treasure in a conflict they're not sure they can easily win.
Mr. Tharoor, I want to talk to you about something very important, the reform of the UN Security Council. That's a topic that has been a major theme in the build-up to the 70th General Assembly. A number of countries are pushing for a permanent seat on the Council. But how do you strike a balance between efficiency and representation? For instance, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said 20 members would be acceptable, but would that be right? What do you think?
There is no particular number that is magically correct. You know, when the Security Council was founded in 1945, it was 11 members out of a total UN membership of 51. In other words, 22% of the UN was in the Security Council. If today you put 22% of the UN there, that will give you a Security Council of 39. And it'll be like a conference, no longer a decision-making council. So there is no real agreed formula. Whatever politically member states can agree upon would be enough. And if there is a consensus around the number 20, I think those states that are seeking expansion will have to join. But with all respect to my dear friends in Europe, it does seem odd that Europe, with 5% of the world's population, should have 33% of the seats on the Security Council, or that 5 countries have permanent seats merely because they happen to have won a war 70 years ago. The geopolitical realities of 2015 are not the same as those of 1945. And I think you have to recognize the growth of new countries in Africa and Asia and elsewhere that have emerged from the colonial experience, who were not members of the UN when the UN was initially founded and the Security Council
so what should the criteria be for new permanent members? What should the criteria... For instance, how do you accept India as a permanent member and not accept Pakistan, or why Brazil and not Argentina, for instance?
Well, on India-Pakistan, the answer is very simple. There is simply no comparison either in size, in population, in GDP, in contributions to the UN.
Okay, talk to me about the criteria. What do you think the criteria should be?
Pakistan's argument, the answer that I was going to give you is that the criteria should be the degree of value to the organization and the degree of indispensability to the conduct of world affairs. Now, obviously, that militates in favor of bigger countries having a voice. Now, Pakistan has objected that India has a disputed frontier with it, and therefore it should not be made a permanent member. But China is a permanent member, and China has a disputed frontier with India too. And there is no problem there. Countries have to conduct themselves responsibly, and I can assure you that India would conduct itself responsibly. But I understand the difficulty. You've pointed to one very important issue, which is how do you decide? Why Brazil? Because it occupies on the Latin American continent a position analogous to India's in the South Asian continent. But at the same time, Brazil is a Portuguese-speaking country that would have to represent a vast majority of Spanish-speaking countries, and that would raise other questions of representation. In Africa, how do you choose amongst the competing claims of the largest economy, South Africa, the largest democracy, Nigeria, and the oldest civilization, Egypt? It's very difficult to make these choices, and that's why a formula has been so elusive in the last 20 years, a formula that will resolve this question. But the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Because if you don't reform the Security Council, the big danger for the United Nations is that the decisions of the Council will cease being accepted by those countries who feel that they lack legitimacy.
We're going to continue talking about that in the second part of our show, but we have to take a short break right now. And when we come back, we'll continue talking to Shashi Tharoor, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations for Communications and Public Information, talking about the United Nations changing, but never less important role in global affairs. Stay with us.
Uncovering hidden stories, moving against the mainstream, going to all lengths to bring real news to Britain. I'm Afshan Ratansi, going underground to bring you the stories that really matter, only on RT.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story or the person with the loudest voice or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
They're the war hawks selling you on the idea that dropping bombs brings peace, to the chicken hawks forcing you to fight in the battles that they start.
The news hawks try to tell you that celebrity gossip and tabloid murder trials are the most important news of the day.
While the hawks of advertising tell you that you are not cool enough unless you buy their product.
Watching the hawks, watching the hawks.
These are the hawks that we, along with our audience, will be watching.
It means someone's boots on the ground for sure. Now,
he wants to push as far as he can.
Once you state the goal, then you have to put plans in place to achieve the goal.
I want to free France from the EU straitjacket.
What we have here is we have the bond markets sending us warning signals. I mean, think of them as the canary in the...
Some opposition to the bombing campaign in Western countries who are concerned about the amount of money that's being spent on it.
We're back with Shashi Tharoor, veteran diplomat and author, former UN Under-Secretary General, member of the Parliament of India, discussing how to ensure the United Nations stays efficient in today's world. So the Security Council is pretty much the only instrument to solve international conflict. What do you think about calls to actually change the rules of the game there, like proposals to, for instance, strip Russia of its veto power?
No, I don't think that's feasible, because the entire logic of creating the veto power was because the founders of the United Nations wanted a mechanism that would keep all the major powers in the world united and inside the United Nations. You know, the League of Nations had collapsed because many of the big powers of the day were not members or had been expelled from it, and they didn't want that to happen. Any step that could be contemplated that would deprive the UN of Russia or China or one of the major countries would not be acceptable to the vast majority of members. And in any case, it could not be done because Russia would have to concur in such an arrangement under the rules for governing the UN Charter. So I don't think you need to worry about that.
Now, as you put it, the absence of reform could discredit the UN, while at the same time, the UN is irreplaceable. Now, with all the complications, it seems very unlikely that reform will be enacted anytime soon. Is there a way out of this sort of dead end for the UN?
Well, I do believe that what we need to do is put a formula to a vote in the General Assembly and see what the vote's like. Because right now what's happening is this has gone on for more than 20 years. I remember Boutros Ghali in 1992 saying that he looked forward to UN Security Council reform being completed by the 50th anniversary of the organization. Well, the 50th anniversary has gone by, the 60th has gone by, the 70th looms next month and is going to go by without Security Council reform. So we really need to fish or cut bait, as the Americans say, actually have an opportunity to find a formula, which many countries are proposing, put it to a vote, and let's see what happens. We can't keep on waiting for the perfect solution. The perfection never comes.
Now, is the rise of blocs such as BRICS, for instance, is partially an answer to the underrepresentation of new large economies at the UN Security Council?
It's not an answer at all, because it's a separate body outside the UN framework. It's very valuable that we have these different organizations that cooperate with each other in a constructive way and that permit dialogue across hemispheres, across continents, across different political systems. But they can't replace the one universal organization there is, which is the UN. I mean, BRICS is doing well, and it's representing something very interesting. But I think the day that it starts trying to be an alternative forum for dispute resolution and so on, then it fundamentally questions the entire logic of a universal organization to which all these members belong.
By the middle of the 21st century, the emerging economies will likely have some parity with developed economies. Now, if the Western Club doesn't encourage cooperation or give them a voice in making global decisions, what will happen?
Well, that is a very important question, because, in fact, by 2040, it is estimated that the economies of the BRICS countries will equal or overtake the economies of the original G7 countries. And that means that they really can't be ignored. Right now, in the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, China has the same weighted vote as Belgium. The decisions taken by the G20 in Pittsburgh in 2008 to shift some of the weighted vote towards the developing and transition economies have not been implemented. So I would argue that this is a big danger, that these countries are not asking to overturn the world order. They're saying, give us a place in the system, give us room at the high table. But if the leaders of the Western countries say, we won't make room for you, that could very seriously divide the world in ways that I genuinely believe are not in the global interest.
Can entities such as BRICS, with their developing cohesion, new financial institutions, etc., be the start of something that may eventually replace the UN? I mean, the Western world will have the G7, and the now developing economies will have the BRICS. Africa will have the African Union. Are we headed into a multipolar era of regional blocs?
Well, I'm not a fan of that idea, Sophie, because I believe in the value of universality. I think the great strength of the United Nations, its principal asset, is that every country belongs to it. And I think that every country that emerges wishes to belong to it. So it really has that great legitimacy that comes from universality, which no other body can have. You mentioned the G8 and BRICS. One can mention the G20 also. But there is no underpinning in international law. These are all self-appointed groups. And if they decide to take the law into their own hands, is it truly international law anymore? I would have some profound misgivings about doing that. I would rather reform and strengthen the one universal organization we have, the United Nations.
But, you keep saying that UN is very important, but if we don't reform the UN, wouldn't it lose its legitimacy?
Well, that I agree. It has to be reformed. But I believe we should make serious efforts to reform it rather than build alternatives. I mean, we can certainly create various ways in which we interact with each other, because we're living in the world of the internet, of the World Wide Web, where all countries are connected to each other, networked in various ways, in various overlapping relationships. But at the same time, we can't substitute that one global body we have with smaller ones, because those smaller ones, it seems to me, risk undermining the principle of universality. I would suggest to you that there's a wonderful old story from a former Soviet foreign minister, an ambassador to the UN, a man called Yakub Malik, who said once that he was, when asked about whether the UN should be dropped and we should have alternative groups, he said it reminded him of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Adam finds that Eve is becoming indifferent to him, and Adam says to Eve, "Eve, is there someone else?" The truth is, there is no one else. There is nothing else that can match the United Nations. We have to recognize the value of that.
Going back to the emerging markets, I mean, the emerging powers aren't trying to break down the current world order. In many ways, they're actually searching for paths to cooperate with what's already there, what's already established. Why is it that the Western countries are wary of their success?
Exactly.
For instance, resisting the opening of the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Bank?
I think, frankly, there the West made a mistake. I think, first of all, in the fulfillment of the Pittsburgh decisions of 2008, American senators have prevented ratification of this agreement. And that's not the American administration, which was in favor of making that weighted voting shift. When it came to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, it was the American government that tried to encourage its friends and partners not to participate. And I think they recognize that they made a big mistake in doing that, because many of their friends went ahead and participated anyway, all but a handful. And I think that their rationale would hold much better if the existing Bretton Woods institutions were more democratic than they actually are.
Now, the 2016 will see the election of the new Secretary General of the United Nations. However, it will almost certainly play second fiddle to the American presidential election in terms of interest, right? What does this say about the top position in the UN? Is it really a position of power?
No, I think it's a position of influence, Sophie, but power, no. I think really most of the powerful member states want a Secretary General who is more Secretary than General. And I think that what the Secretary General is able to do very often is to move the international agenda through effective articulation of ideas, playing a very valuable convening role in getting governments together, and promoting important new objectives, such as, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which will set targets for the next 15 years, beyond the likely term of the next Secretary General. Those are all things that a Secretary General can do. But exercising power, as Stalin said about the Pope, how many divisions has the Pope? The Secretary General has no power that member states are not willing to give him.
Now, when you were running for Secretary General in the United Nations, your bid was vetoed by the United States, and it's actually claimed that Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice didn't want the UN Secretary General to be too powerful or too influential, like you put it. Is that inevitable, that this position has to be weak to be acceptable to all, to keep the balance?
Right, well, we know this from the very disloyal memoir written by her ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton, who actually quoted her, quote unquote, as saying, "We don't want a strong Secretary General." I think that's actually a pity, because I don't think that governments benefit from an approach like that. And I would certainly hope that in 2016, that governments will take a more responsible attitude. I believe the odds are that it's likely to be somebody from Eastern Europe, probably somebody who speaks Russian. And I think that you all in the Security Council, but particularly amongst the Permanent Five, have an obligation to ensure that the person picked has the ability to manage consensus, to promote global interests and global agendas, to get along with all sorts of countries, and at the same time to articulate a set of ideals and vision that will carry the world forward in the next decade.
But should the UN Secretary General be a position of more influence and more power? What do you think? Should the UN Secretary General be more powerful?
Well, power is a dangerous word because it implies military strength and the capacity to affect certain events around the globe, that power rests with the Security Council and not with the Secretary General. The Secretary General can only carry out mandates given to him or her by the Security Council. And I think, frankly, we are not yet ready for the kind of world government where a Secretary General can move armies by himself or herself. We are still a collection of sovereign states, and these sovereign states will want to work together to ensure that governments can actually get their wishes done across the world through the mechanism of the United Nations. No more and no less. It still is a very important and influential role for the Secretary General, but the UN is above all the member states.
Mr. Tharoor, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We're speaking to Shashi Tharoor, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, Chairman of the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs of the Indian Parliament, discussing how to change decades-long talk of UN reform into an action, and if there's a way to make everybody's voice heard in the process. That's it for this edition of Sophie & Co. I'll see you next time.